When you think of pirates, your mind probably conjures images of swashbuckling adventure, treasure maps, and freedom on the open seas. Perhaps you imagine Captain Jack Sparrow's theatrical antics, or Blackbeard's fearsome beard wreathed in smoke. The romanticized vision of piracy has captured our collective imagination for centuries, filling countless books, films, and fantasies with tales of daring raids and buried gold. But strip away the Hollywood gloss, peel back the layers of legend and mythology, and you'll discover a far different reality. The true life of a pirate during the golden age of piracy was a brutal, disease-ridden, and often short existence marked by violence, desperation, and hardship that would horrify most modern people. The period we call the Golden Age of piracy stretched roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s, though some historians narrow this window even further. This era saw thousands of men and a handful of women turn to piracy in the waters of the Caribbean, along the eastern seaboard of colonial America, off the coast of West Africa, and in the Indian Ocean. These weren't simply criminals looking for easy money. Many were former naval sailors, merchant seamen, or privateers who had been cast aside when wars ended and employment dried up. They fled lives of brutal discipline, starvation wages, and savage punishments aboard legitimate vessels, only to discover that the pirate's life, while offering certain freedoms, came with its own terrible costs. The ships that became floating homes for these maritime outlaws were far from the spacious, romantic vessels of fiction. A typical pirate ship might measure only 120 feet long by 40 feet wide, yet it would house anywhere from 80 to 200 men. Imagine living your entire existence in a space smaller than many modern apartments, sharing it with hundreds of unwashed bodies, with no escape from the constant motion of the waves, the creaking of timber, and the overwhelming stench of human habitation. This was the pirate's reality, day after day, week after week, sometimes for months on end without touching land. Below deck, conditions descended into something resembling a floating dungeon. The spaces where pirates lived and slept were dark, damp, and utterly filthy. Sunlight rarely penetrated these lower levels, and when ports were closed at night for security, the air became thick and suffocating. One sailor described sleeping on a deck with 500 to 600 men, in a cavern only 6 feet high, where the heat from so many human bodies packed together became absolutely overpowering. The temperature would rise to unbearable levels in tropical waters, with humidity making every surface slick with moisture and mold. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist aboard a pirate ship. Every man could see what every other man was doing at nearly all times. When nature called, there was no private bathroom to retreat to. Common crew members relieved themselves on platforms with holes cut into them, positioned right on the open deck, or used the bow of the ship where everyone could see. Only the captain enjoyed the luxury of a chamber pot in his cabin, which would then be unceremoniously dumped overboard. This complete lack of privacy extended to all aspects of life, creating a forced intimacy that could breed both camaraderie and murderous resentment in equal measure. The sleeping arrangements were as uncomfortable as everything else about life at sea. Most pirates slept in hammocks slung from the rafters in communal spaces, swaying with every movement of the ship. Some didn't even have hammocks and simply lay on the hard wooden floor, perhaps with a thin blanket if they were fortunate. During storms, men would be thrown from their hammocks or sent sliding across the deck. The constant rocking made sleep difficult, even in calm weather, and many pirates suffered from perpetual exhaustion. The hammock, despite its discomfort, was actually preferred by experienced sailors because it would sway with the ship's movement rather than fighting against it, making it slightly easier to rest during rough seas. Rats were an inescapable presence aboard ship, thriving in the darkness and filth below deck. These vermin did more than just startle sleeping men in the night. They gnawed through crucial ropes and rigging, putting the entire vessel at risk. They contaminated and consumed precious food stores, turning already meagre rations into an even more desperate situation. Worse yet, they carried diseases that could spread like wildfire through the cramped confines of the ship. Pirates learned to sleep with their arms crossed over their chests to prevent rats from running across their faces, and some would wake to find bites on their hands or feet. Cockroaches were equally abundant, crawling over everything and everyone, particularly at night when the ships were darkest. A large portion of the crew was busy keeping the ship sailing, maintain the rigging, man the weapons, or perform countless other necessary tasks. The work was physically exhausting and often dangerous. Men climbed high into the rigging to adjust sails, a task that could prove fatal if they lost their grip, or if a sudden gust of wind threw them from their perch. Many pirates couldn't swim, despite spending their lives at sea, so falling overboard usually meant death. Even if a man survived the fall, ships rarely turned back to rescue someone who went over the side, and the presence of sharks in tropical waters made drowning almost preferable to what might come next. When not engaged in the actual sailing of the ship, pirates spent their time maintaining the vessel in what seemed like an endless cycle of repairs and upkeep. Wooden ships required constant attention to stay seaworthy. Decks needed to be swabbed not just for cleanliness, but to prevent the wood from drying out and cracking. Sails had to be mended, ropes spliced and replaced, and the hull inspected for damage or leaks. Every few months, the entire ship would need to be careened, hauled up onto a beach, and tipped on its side so the hull could be scraped clean of barnacles, seaweed, and other marine growth that slowed the vessel down. This was back-breaking work that left the ship vulnerable to attack, so it was done on isolated beaches with men posted as lookouts. The work was punctuated by moments of tedious boredom that could stretch for weeks when no prey appeared on the horizon. Pirates would patrol shipping lanes, watching and waiting for a merchant vessel that might be worth attacking. During these long stretches of inactivity, men had to find ways to occupy themselves or risk going mad from the monotony. Some played games of dice or cards, gambling away their shares of plunder that they hadn't yet captured. Others carved bone or wood, creating scrimshaw artwork or simple tools. Music was enormously important for morale, and sea shanties served a dual purpose. They synchronized the crew's efforts during coordinated work like raising sails or hauling anchor, and they provided entertainment and emotional relief during the endless days at sea. Those who could play instruments were highly valued, and some pirate articles even included provisions about musicians, with one captain threatening punishment for anyone who was a bad musician, as they needed good music to maintain spirits. Storytelling became another crucial pastime. Pirates would gather to share tales of previous adventures, embellish accounts of near misses with the law, or spin entirely fictional yarns about legendary treasures and impossible feats. These stories served to build a shared culture and mythology among the crew, reinforcing bonds and creating a sense of identity separate from the civilized world they had left behind. The tales grew taller with each telling, and many of the pirate legends we know today likely began as exaggerated campfire stories told on the deck of a ship under a tropical sky. Despite all the hardship, there were occasional moments of genuine pleasure. When a pirate ship successfully captured a prize, particularly one carrying rum or wine, celebrations could become wild affairs. Pirates would break open barrels of alcohol, drinking themselves into oblivion, and throwing buckets of liquor on each other in pure wantonness. One witness described pirates gathering great many half hogsheads of claret and French brandy, knocking their heads out and dipping cans and bowls directly into them to drink, all while throwing full buckets of alcohol on one another. These were men who knew their lives could end at any moment, and they lived with an intensity and abandon that reflected that awareness. Yet even during these celebrations, violence was never far away. Pirates lived by brutal codes, and disputes could quickly turn deadly. The close quarters and forced intimacy meant that minor disagreements could fester into murderous rage. A man who felt insulted might challenge another to a duel, to be fought on shore at the next opportunity. The pirate codes usually forbade fighting aboard ship as it disrupted order and could damage the vessel itself, so grudges had to be carried until land provided a place to settle them. These duels were often fought to the death, with the victor returning to the ship while the loser was left behind, buried in an unmarked grave, if his friends bothered with a burial at all. The experience of being constantly surrounded by other men, with no privacy and no escape, created psychological pressures that are difficult for modern people to understand. Sailors and pirates developed a peculiar mixture of intense loyalty and bitter resentment toward their crewmates. The men you lived with were the only people you could depend on in a crisis, yet they were also the ones who got on your nerves day after day, whose habits and quirks became insufferable through constant exposure. This paradox shaped pirate culture in fundamental ways, contributing to both the democratic tendencies that set pirate ships apart from naval vessels and the sudden explosions of violence that could tear a crew apart. But for every man who embraced piracy wholeheartedly, there were others who had been forced into it and yearned for a return to civilization. When pirate ships captured merchant vessels, they often pressed skilled crewmen into service, particularly specialists like carpenters, surgeons, and navigators. These men might be given a choice: join the pirate crew or be cast adrift in a small boat with minimal supplies. But it was hardly a choice at all. Some pressed men eventually came to identify with their captors and became enthusiastic pirates themselves, while others waited for any chance to escape. The line between victim and perpetrator was often blurred in the pirate world, and many men carried guilt for crimes they had been compelled to commit. The demographic makeup of pirate crews was surprisingly diverse for the era. While many pirates were English, French, or Dutch, crews also included Spanish sailors, Portuguese adventurers, escaped African slaves, and Native Americans who had learned seafaring skills. This racial and ethnic mixing was highly unusual for the 1700s, when rigid social hierarchies and racial segregation were the norm. On pirate ships, what mattered was whether a man could do his job and contribute to the crew's success. Several pirates of African descent rose to positions of respect and authority, something that would have been nearly impossible in legitimate society. This relative egalitarianism was born of necessity. Pirates couldn't afford to waste skilled labor based on prejudice, but it represented one of the more progressive aspects of an otherwise brutal culture. Women were officially forbidden aboard most pirate ships, as their presence was believed to bring bad luck and cause discord among the crew. Yet we know of several women who defied this prohibition by disguising themselves as men, most famously Anne Bonny and Mary Red, who sailed with Calico Jack Rackham. These women proved themselves as fierce fighters, and when their sex was discovered, they were accepted by the crew. Other women worked as pirates without disguise in Chinese waters, where cultural attitudes were different. The scarcity of women aboard ships meant that pirates often formed intense same-sex bonds that may or may not have been sexual in nature. The historical record is murky on this point, but it's clear that the exclusively male environment fostered relationships that would have been considered scandalous on land. As difficult as the daily existence aboard ship was, it was only the beginning of the pirates' trials. The food they ate and the water they drank presented challenges that could prove just as deadly as any naval battle. When a pirate ship first set sail from port, the crew might enjoy relatively good eating for a week or two. Fresh bread, fruits, vegetables, cheese, eggs, and milk were available, provided by live animals kept aboard for this purpose. Chickens scratched around in coops, providing eggs until they stopped laying, at which point they went into the pot. Pigs and even cows might be kept aboard larger vessels, fed on scraps until they were slaughtered. These fresh provisions were jealously guarded, often reserved primarily for the captain and officers, though pirate ships were more egalitarian about food distribution than naval or merchant vessels. But fresh food spoiled quickly in the tropical heat that characterized most pirate waters. Within days, milk would sour, fruit would rot, vegetables would wilt and turn to mush, and meat would begin to stink. After 2 weeks at sea, the fresh provisions were gone, and the crew settled into a monotonous diet that would last for the remainder of the voyage, sometimes stretching for months. The staple food aboard any sailing ship was hardtack, also called ship's biscuit or sea biscuit. These were simple crackers made from flour and water, baked until they became nearly indestructible. The goal was to create something that would resist mold and decay for as long as possible. And in this respect, hardtack succeeded admirably. A properly stored hardtack biscuit could last for years. Unfortunately, making food last a long time required making it extremely hard and utterly flavourless. Hardtack had to be soaked in water, soup, or rum before it could be eaten without breaking your teeth. Pirates would dip these biscuits into whatever liquid was available, letting them soften until they could be chewed. Even this unappetizing fare didn't remain pure for long. Within weeks of setting sail, weevils would begin to infest the hardtack stores. These small beetles would burrow into the biscuits, lay their eggs, and fill them with larvae. Pirates learned to tap their hardtack against the table before eating, knocking out as many weevils as possible, or to eat in the dark so they couldn't see the maggots squirming in their food. The other major component of the pirate diet was salted meat. Before refrigeration, the only way to preserve meat for long voyages was through heavy salting or smoking. Large barrels of salted beef and pork were standard provisions aboard every ship. The meat was so heavily salted that it could remain edible, in the loosest sense of the word, for months or even years. But the salt transformed the texture, turning the meat hard and tough, almost like wood. It required long soaking in water or extended boiling before it could be chewed, and even then it was barely palatable. One sailor compared salted beef to black oak, giving a sense of just how unpleasant it was. As the weeks turned to months at sea, even the salted meat would begin to deteriorate. It would turn greenish or black, develop a vile odour, and become so tough that no amount of soaking could make it edible. At this point, the ship's cook had to get creative. Galley cooks became adept at disguising rotten meat with whatever spices and herbs they had available. Garlic, pepper, and any other strong flavours would be added to stews in an attempt to mask the taste of putrefaction. Sometimes the effort worked well enough that men could get the food down. Other times, the stench was so overpowering that even starving men could barely force themselves to eat. Pirates occasionally prepared a dish called salmagundi, which was essentially a catch-all salad made from whatever was available. This might include chopped meat or fish, pickled vegetables, hard-boiled eggs, onions, garlic, olives, grapes, cabbage, oil, vinegar, and any spices at hand. When ingredients were fresh, salmagundi could be quite tasty. More often, it was an attempt to combine stale, nearly spoiled ingredients into something that was at least edible. The dish became associated with pirates, particularly because it embodied their improvisational approach to survival. You used whatever you had, mixed it together, and hoped for the best. Some pirates became skilled at fishing to supplement their diet, though this was more challenging than it might seem. Most fish stay close to coastal waters, so fishing in the open ocean yielded limited results. When ships were sailing at speed, it was nearly impossible to fish effectively. The best opportunities came during calms or when anchored near islands. Pirates would catch whatever they could: fish, sea turtles, even seabirds. Sea turtle meat was considered a delicacy, and turtles could be kept alive aboard ship for extended periods, providing fresh meat when nothing else was available. One pirate surgeon described the taste as similar to chicken, making turtles highly prized when they could be caught. When luck was with them and they captured a merchant ship, pirates would eagerly plunder the vessel's food stores along with any treasure. Sometimes the food was more valuable than gold, especially if the crew had been at sea for months and was desperate for something, anything, other than wormy hardtack and rancid salt meat. Fresh bread, wine, fruit, and vegetables from a newly captured ship would be consumed immediately in an orgy of eating and drinking. This feast or famine approach to eating was characteristic of pirate life. Long stretches of deprivation, punctuated by brief periods of abundance. The problem of drinking water was even more challenging than food. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels would begin to turn foul within days of being drawn. It would develop a green scum on the surface, start to smell, and eventually become almost undrinkable. The water took on the taste of the barrel itself, often with a strong woody, mouldy flavour that grew worse over time. Sailors and pirates learned to hold their noses while drinking, trying not to taste or smell the putrid water they were forcing down. Sometimes the water became so contaminated that drinking it would cause dysentery, which could be fatal in the conditions aboard ship. Because fresh water was so unreliable, pirates drank alcohol whenever possible. Rum became the drink most associated with pirates, partly because it was produced in the Caribbean where many of them operated, but also because it didn't spoil and could be stored indefinitely. Pirates drank their rum in various ways: straight, mixed with water in a concoction called grog, or combined with sugar and nutmeg into a slightly more palatable beverage. They also consumed whatever wine and brandy they could capture from merchant vessels. Beer was popular when available, and pirates would drink literally anything alcoholic rather than face another day of putrid water. The constant consumption of alcohol had predictable effects. Many pirates were perpetually drunk or hungover, which didn't help with the already dangerous work of sailing a ship. Drunkenness led to accidents, arguments that turned violent, and general chaos that undermined discipline. Some pirate captains tried to limit drinking to certain times or rationed the alcohol, but this was difficult to enforce. The legendary pirate Bartholomew Roberts was unusual in that he preferred tea. The poor diet and questionable water led to malnutrition and disease on a scale that's difficult for modern people to comprehend. Pirates were constantly undernourished, lacking essential vitamins and minerals that fresh fruits and vegetables would have provided. This made them susceptible to a horrifying array of illnesses that ravaged ship after ship. The most feared of these was scurvy. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, which the human body cannot produce or store for long periods. Without regular intake of vitamin C from fresh fruits and vegetables, the body begins to break down in terrible ways. The early symptoms of scurvy included fatigue, weakness, and general malaise. Men would feel tired all the time, unable to muster the energy even for basic tasks. Their skin would begin to look dirty or discolored, sometimes developing dark spots or bruises. These symptoms could be dismissed as simply the result of hard work and poor living conditions, so scurvy often went unrecognized in its early stages. As the disease progressed, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. The gums would begin to swell and turn spongy, bleeding at the slightest touch. Men would wake to find their mouths full of blood, or they would have to sleep with their heads hanging over the side of their hammocks to let the blood drain out rather than choking on it. Their teeth would loosen and eventually fall out, leaving them unable to chew even the soft food that might have helped them. Old wounds that had healed years before would suddenly break open and begin bleeding again, as the body lost its ability to maintain scar tissue. New wounds wouldn't heal at all, instead festering and bleeding continuously. The later stages of scurvy were truly nightmarish. The victim's limbs would become stiff and swollen, making movement difficult or impossible. Black discoloration would spread across their body, particularly in the armpits and behind the legs. Red spots would appear on the skin, marking internal bleeding. The person would essentially be bleeding to death from the inside, slowly and agonizingly. They would become too weak to leave their hammock, unable to eat, speak, or care for themselves. At this point, death was usually a mercy, as there was no treatment available aboard ship for advanced scurvy. Between 1500 and 1800, an estimated 2 million sailors died from scurvy, making it the leading cause of death at sea, outstripping battles, storms, and all other causes combined. The cure for scurvy was actually quite simple: consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables containing vitamin C. Citrus fruits were particularly effective, but this knowledge was not widely understood or accepted until the mid-1800s, despite some physicians making the connection much earlier. A Scottish doctor named James Lind conducted experiments in 1747, proving that lemon juice could cure scurvy, but his findings were largely ignored by naval authorities for decades. Even when the cure was known, getting fresh fruit to ships that had been at sea for months was logistically difficult. Pirates operating in the Caribbean had some advantage here, as tropical islands provided access to fruits that were rich in vitamin C, but only if they stopped to gather them regularly. Beyond scurvy, pirates faced a host of other diseases that could spread rapidly through the cramped, unsanitary conditions aboard ship. Dysentery, an inflammatory disease of the intestines, caused severe diarrhea that could lead to fatal dehydration. In the absence of clean water and proper sanitation, dysentery could spread through an entire crew within days. Men would lie in their hammocks, too weak to move, fouling themselves because they couldn't make it to the crew toilets. The stench below deck during a dysentery outbreak was beyond description. Tuberculosis, a bacterial infection of the lungs, thrived in the damp, close quarters of a ship. The disease caused a chronic cough that could last for months, gradually wearing down the victim as they coughed up blood and lost weight. Tuberculosis was contagious, spreading through the recycled air below deck, and there was no effective treatment. A man with tuberculosis was essentially receiving a slow death sentence. In tropical waters, pirates encountered yellow fever and malaria, both transmitted by mosquitoes, though no one at the time understood how these diseases spread. Yellow fever caused high fever, jaundice that turned the skin yellow, bleeding, and often death. Malaria produced cycles of fever and chills that would recur for years, weakening victims and sometimes killing them during particularly severe episodes. Pirates likely believed they contracted these diseases from bad air or spoiled food, having no knowledge of the mosquitoes that were actually responsible. Smallpox was another deadly threat, particularly dangerous because it was highly contagious and could spread like wildfire through a crew. The disease caused high fever and a horrific rash of pustules that covered the entire body. Survivors were often left badly scarred. Venereal diseases like syphilis were rampant among sailors and pirates who frequented prostitutes in port cities. Syphilis was called the Great Pox, distinguishing it from smallpox, and it progressed through stages over years, eventually causing madness and death if left untreated. Again, there was no effective treatment available, and men simply had to live with the disease and its symptoms. Given the prevalence of disease and the constant danger of injury from combat and accidents, the role of ship surgeon was absolutely crucial aboard a pirate vessel. Surgeons were so valuable that when pirates captured a merchant ship, any surgeon aboard was immediately pressed into service, often by force. These medical men had no choice but to join the pirate crew, as their skills were desperately needed. The pirate codes often specified that surgeons received extra shares of plunder, recognizing their importance to the crew's survival. The training and knowledge of these ship surgeons varied wildly. Some had formal medical training and had studied at universities or served apprenticeships with established physicians. Others were essentially self-taught, having learned their trade through experience and observation. The quality of medical care available depended entirely on who happened to be serving as the ship's surgeon. At worst, the job might fall to the ship's carpenter or cook. Men with no medical training whatsoever, but who were expected to do their best in emergencies. Medical knowledge in the 1700s was primitive by modern standards. The germ theory of disease had not yet been developed, so no one understood that bacteria and viruses caused infections. Instead, medical practice was still dominated by ancient theories going back to Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. These long-dead doctors had theorized that human health depended on the balance of four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humours became unbalanced, disease resulted, or so the theory went. This led to treatments that were not only useless, but often actively harmful. The most common treatment for virtually any ailment was bloodletting. Doctors believed that excess blood was the primary cause of illness, so they would deliberately cut patients and drain blood, sometimes removing several pints at a time. This was done using sharp knives or by applying leeches that would attach to the skin and feed on the patient's blood. For a person who was already weakened by disease or injury, the loss of additional blood often hastened their death rather than helping them recover. Yet bloodletting remained standard medical practice throughout this period. Other treatments included induced vomiting, forced diarrhea, and attempts to make patients urinate more, all in an effort to expel the supposed bad humours from the body. These purging methods left patients dehydrated and exhausted, making it even harder for them to fight off whatever was actually wrong with them. Medicines were concocted from herbs, minerals, and animal parts, with recipes that had been passed down for generations, but whose effectiveness was questionable at best. Some of these traditional remedies did have genuine medicinal properties, but many were useless or even toxic. When it came to injuries rather than diseases, surgeons had a very limited toolkit. For wounds to the extremities, especially those that showed signs of infection or gangrene, the standard treatment was amputation. This was a horrifying procedure that had to be performed quickly, without anesthesia or proper antiseptics. The patient might be given rum to drink in an attempt to dull the pain and steady their nerves, but they would be fully conscious throughout the ordeal. The amputation procedure was brutal in its simplicity. The surgeon would use a saw to cut through the bone, working as quickly as possible because speed was essential. The patient had only about 10 minutes from the start of the procedure until they would likely die from shock and blood loss. The surgeon would cut through flesh and muscle with a knife, saw through the bone, then use a hot broad axe or iron to cauterize the stump and stop the bleeding. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as the hot metal seared the wound. The patient's screams could be heard throughout the ship, a sound that haunted everyone who heard it. If the patient survived the amputation itself, which many did not, they then faced the very real danger of infection. Without antibiotics or any real understanding of sterilization, infected wounds were common and often fatal. The surgeon would do his best to keep the stump clean, but given the filthy conditions aboard ship, this was nearly impossible. Many men who survived the initial surgery died days or weeks later, when infection set in. Those who did survive and heal were left to adapt to life with a missing limb. Wooden legs and hook hands weren't just dramatic pirate accessories from fiction. They were real, crude prosthetics that allowed amputees to continue functioning. The pirate articles often included detailed compensation schedules for injuries received in battle. This was one of the more progressive aspects of pirate society. A man who was disabled in the crew's service would be compensated from the common plunder. The amounts varied by which body part was lost and how severely it impaired the pirate's ability to work. A right arm, being more valuable than a left arm for most people, was worth more in compensation. The loss of an eye might earn a pirate several hundred pieces of eight. These payments acknowledged that the crew had a collective responsibility to care for men who were injured while fighting for the common good, a form of proto-insurance that was actually more generous than what legitimate sailors could expect from merchant companies or navies. Despite the terrible conditions, poor food, rampant disease, and primitive medical care, Many pirates considered their situation better than what they had left behind. This seems almost incomprehensible until you understand just how brutal life was for sailors in the regular navy or on merchant ships during this period. Naval and merchant sailors faced all the same hardships as pirates. The same terrible food, disease-ridden quarters, dangerous work, and risk of disease. But they also endured something that pirates had largely escaped: the tyrannical authority of captains who ruled their ships like floating dictatorships. On naval and merchant vessels, captains had nearly absolute power over their crews. They could order floggings for the smallest infractions, withhold food and water as punishment, and even execute sailors who disobeyed orders. The lash was used freely and brutally. A man might receive dozens of lashes for being late to his watch, for talking back to an officer, or simply for failing to work quickly enough. The cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords, would tear the flesh from a man's back, leaving permanent scars and sometimes causing injuries that led to infection and death. There was no appeal, no trial, no justice beyond the captain's whim. In contrast, pirate ships operated under a radically different system that would have seemed almost democratic to modern eyes. This wasn't born from any idealistic philosophy about equality or human rights. Rather, it emerged from practical necessity and the nature of piracy itself. Pirates were voluntary associations of criminals who had to work together to survive and profit. A captain who became too tyrannical would simply be deposed by his crew, and everyone knew it. This created a system of checks and balances that, while far from perfect, gave common pirates a voice in their own governance that was unprecedented for the era. The foundation of this system was the Pirate Code, also called Articles of Agreement. When a crew decided to turn pirate, or when a new ship was captured and put into service, the men would gather to create and sign articles that would govern their behaviour. These were written contracts that every man signed or made his mark upon, binding himself to follow the rules and accept the consequences if he broke them. The articles varied from ship to ship, but they shared common elements that reveal a lot about pirate values and concerns. The articles typically began by establishing how plunder would be divided. This was the most important issue for most pirates, as the promise of wealth was what had drawn them to this dangerous life. The standard formula gave the captain 1.5 or 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.25 shares, and common crew members 1 share each. Skilled specialists like the surgeon, carpenter, and gunner might receive slightly more than a common share. This meant that the captain earned only slightly more than ordinary crew members, a stark contrast to merchant and naval vessels, where officers lived in luxury while common sailors starved. Some articles were even more egalitarian. The famous pirate Bartholomew Roberts, who captured over 400 ships during his career, operated under articles that gave him only 2 shares compared to 1 for common crew. This relatively modest differential meant that wealth was spread more evenly than in almost any other institution of the time. When a ship was captured and its cargo divided, even the lowest-ranking pirate could expect to walk away with a substantial sum, at least by the standards of an era when common labourers earned pennies per day. The articles also established rules about conduct aboard ship. Fighting among crew members was typically forbidden, as it could spiral into feuds that tore the crew apart. Instead, disputes had to be settled on shore through formal duels, supervised by the crew to ensure fairness. The rules about duelling were often quite specific. Both men would be given the same weapons, typically pistols and swords. They would face each other at a set distance, fire their pistols, and if both survived, continue fighting with swords until one was disabled or killed. This ritualized violence channeled inevitable conflicts in a way that didn't threaten the ship's operation. Theft from fellow crew members was considered one of the worst crimes a pirate could commit. The penalty was often marooning, being left on a deserted island with minimal supplies. Considering that pirates were literally thieves who stole for a living, Their harsh attitude toward internal theft might seem hypocritical, but it made perfect sense from their perspective. The crew had to trust each other absolutely when facing external enemies. If pirates couldn't trust their shipmates not to steal from them, the entire social fabric would collapse. Theft from captured ships was encouraged. Theft from fellow pirates was unforgivable. Many pirate articles included rules about women. Most forbade bringing women aboard ship, either as passengers or through capture. This wasn't simply misogyny, though there was plenty of that in the 1700s. The prohibition existed because captains and crews recognized that competition for women's attention could destroy discipline and turn shipmates into enemies. Some articles specified that any man who seduced a woman and brought her aboard disguised as a man would suffer death. The famous pirate John Phillips included in his articles that if any man were found seducing a woman and carrying her to sea in disguise, he would suffer death. These rules were sometimes broken, as the cases of Anne Bonny and Mary Red demonstrate, but the prohibition was common. Gambling was another frequent subject of pirate articles. While card games and dice were popular pastimes, high-stakes gambling could lead to disputes that threatened ship discipline. Some articles banned gambling for money entirely, allowing games only for amusement. Others set limits on how much could be wagered. The goal was to prevent situations where one pirate might lose everything to another, creating resentment that could explode into violence. Desertion was treated as a serious crime, though the punishment varied. Some articles specified marooning for desertion, while others allowed for flogging or loss of share. This reflected a practical concern. Pirates needed every skilled hand, and losing crew members weakened the ship's fighting capacity. At the same time, the fact that desertion was even mentioned in the articles tells us that it happened with some regularity. Not every man who joined a pirate crew did so willingly, and even those who started out enthusiastic might have second thoughts after experiencing the reality. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of pirate democracy was the election of officers. On most pirate ships, the crew elected their captain and could remove him if he proved incompetent or unpopular. This was revolutionary for the time. In navies and on merchant vessels, captains were appointed by admiralty officials or ship owners, and ordinary sailors had no say whatsoever. On pirate ships, a captain served at the pleasure of the crew. If enough men became dissatisfied with his leadership, they could call for a vote and elect someone else. This actually happened with some regularity. The pirate captain Charles Vane was deposed by his crew after he refused to attack a French warship they wanted to capture, and they elected Calico Jack Rackham in his place. The position of quartermaster was equally important and also elected by the crew. The quartermaster served as a check on the captain's power, representing the crew's interests. While the captain had absolute authority during battle, at all other times the quartermaster's voice carried equal or greater weight. The quartermaster supervised the distribution of plunder, settled disputes between crew members, and led the boarding parties when ships were attacked. He could countermand the captain's orders if he believed they were not in the crew's best interest. This division of power prevented any one man from becoming a tyrant. Important decisions were made by crew vote. Whether to attack a particular ship, where to sail next, how to punish someone who had broken the articles, these matters were decided democratically, with every man having an equal voice. The captain might make recommendations, but if the crew voted against him, his opinion carried no more weight than anyone else's. This system worked because it had to. A captain who tried to impose his will against the crew's wishes would likely wake up with his throat cut or find himself abandoned on the next island they passed. This democratic system had its drawbacks. Important decisions could be delayed while the crew debated and voted. Discipline could be difficult to maintain when the captain's authority was constantly subject to challenge. In battle situations, split-second decisions were necessary, and there was no time for voting. This is why the articles typically specified that the captain had absolute command during fights and chases. Someone had to make instant decisions, and it was better to follow one leader than to have everyone trying to decide what to do. But once the danger passed, power reverted to the collective. The injury compensation clauses in pirate articles represented another progressive element. Bartholomew Roberts's articles, which have survived in their entirety, specified exact compensation for various injuries. The loss of a right arm earned 600 pieces of 8. A left arm or right leg was worth 500. A left leg was worth 400. The loss of an eye or finger was worth 100. These payments came out of the common plunder before it was divided among the crew. A man who was maimed in battle wouldn't be cast aside to starve or beg. He would receive compensation that could support him for years, though of course it could never truly make up for the loss of a limb or eye. Some articles even included what we might call retirement provisions. A pirate who had accumulated enough wealth might decide to retire from active service. The articles would specify under what conditions a man could leave with his share, and some even included provisions for supporting elderly or severely disabled pirates who could no longer work. Again, this seems almost enlightened compared to merchant and naval service, where sailors who became too old or injured to work were simply discarded. The democratic nature of pirate ships and the relatively fair distribution of wealth led some historians to describe pirates as proto-revolutionaries or early socialists. This is probably going too far. Pirates weren't motivated by political ideology or a desire to reform society. They were criminals pursuing their own self-interest in an environment where cooperation was essential for survival. But their systems did demonstrate that alternatives to rigid hierarchy were possible and could work effectively even in dangerous, high-stress situations. Not every pirate ship operated democratically. Some captains, through force of personality or superior fighting skills, maintained much tighter control over their crews. Blackbeard seems to have ruled more autocratically than many of his contemporaries, maintaining discipline through fear and intimidation. But even Blackbeard had to keep his crew satisfied with plunder and couldn't push them too far. The fact that pirate democracy was the norm rather than the exception says something important about what these men valued and what they had left behind. The weapons pirates carried and the tactics they used in combat shaped every aspect of their existence. A pirate's effectiveness as a fighting man determined his survival and the success of his enterprise. The weapons of the golden age of piracy were varied, deadly, and required significant skill to use effectively. The most iconic pirate weapon was the cutlass, a short sword with a slightly curved blade, typically measuring around 24 inches long. The cutlass was ideal for fighting in the confined spaces of a ship's deck or below deck. A longer sword would be cumbersome and liable to get caught in rigging or struck against masts and railings. The cutlass could deliver devastating slashing blows that could sever limbs or nearly decapitate an opponent. It was simple, robust, and didn't require the refined fencing skills needed for a rapier or other gentleman's sword. A man could learn basic cutlass fighting relatively quickly, though mastery took years. Pirates also carried a variety of pistols. These were smoothbore, flintlock weapons that were wildly inaccurate beyond about 10 yards, but absolutely devastating at close range. A heavy pistol ball could shatter bone and create horrific wounds. Pirates often carried multiple pistols, as reloading in the midst of battle was essentially impossible. The loading process was complex and time-consuming, requiring the pirate to measure powder, ram down a patch and ball, prime the pan, and hope the whole assembly would fire when needed. In combat, a pirate might fire his pistols once, and then resort to his cutlass and knives for the rest of the fight. Blackbeard famously wore 6 pistols during a battle, hanging them from a bandolier across his chest. This wasn't mere showmanship, though it certainly added to his fearsome appearance. 6 pistols meant 6 shots before he had to rely on blades, giving him a significant advantage in close quarters fighting. Other pirates followed similar practices, bristling with weapons like human arsenals, The psychological impact was almost as important as the practical benefit. An enemy seeing a pirate armed to the teeth might surrender rather than fight. Grenades were used by pirates, though not in the modern sense. These were glass bottles or hollow iron balls filled with gunpowder and equipped with a slow-burning fuse. A pirate would light the fuse and hurl the grenade onto an enemy deck or into the rigging. When it exploded, it created devastating effects in the confined space of a ship. Shrapnel from the container would fly in all directions, wounding anyone nearby. The explosion could start fires, especially if it landed near pitch or gunpowder stores. The psychological effect of explosions was probably as important as the physical damage, as the noise and chaos could break the will of defenders. Long-range combat depended on the ship's cannons. Pirates preferred smaller, faster ships that could outmaneuver larger merchant vessels and even some naval ships. These vessels typically carried between 10 and 40 cannons, though some of the largest pirate ships might have more. The cannons came in various sizes, from small 3-pounders to massive 24-pound guns. The number referred to the weight of the cannonball the gun fired. Larger cannons had longer range and more destructive power, but were heavier and took longer to load and fire. Operating cannons required trained crews, working in carefully coordinated teams. Each gun had a crew of 4 to 8 men, depending on its size. They had to swab out the barrel after each shot to extinguish any remaining sparks, load the powder charge, ram it down, insert the ball, prime the touch hole, run the gun out through the gun port, aim it, and fire. The recoil from firing would send the gun rolling backward, potentially crushing anyone in its path. In the heat of battle, with enemy cannonballs smashing through the hull and splinters flying like shrapnel, maintaining the fire discipline and coordination necessary to operate the guns required tremendous skill and courage. Pirates rarely wanted to sink enemy ships. A sunken ship meant sunken cargo, and cargo was what they were after. Instead, they aimed to disable the enemy vessel, making it unable to flee or fight effectively. They would aim for the masts and rigging, trying to bring down sails and leave the ship dead in the water. They would aim for the rudder, making the ship unsteerable. Once the enemy was disabled, pirates could close in for boarding and take the ship intact with all its valuable cargo. The actual tactics of pirate combat were more sophisticated than popular culture suggests. Pirates didn't simply sail up alongside an enemy and start shooting. They used their knowledge of wind and currents to position themselves advantageously. A fast pirate ship could chase down slower merchant vessels, and pirates became expert at judging whether a chase would be worth the effort. They looked for ships sitting low in the water, which suggested heavy cargo. They watched how a ship handled, trying to determine if it was well armed and heavily crewed, or if it would be an easy target. When pirates decided to attack, they often approached under false colours, flying the flag of a friendly nation to get close without alarming their prey. Only when they were near enough that escape was impossible would they raise their true colours. Often the famous Jolly Roger skull and crossbones, though many pirates flew personalised flags. The psychological warfare began before any shots were fired. The reputation for violence and ruthlessness that pirates cultivated was actually a tactical tool. If a pirate crew had a reputation for torturing and murdering everyone who resisted, their targets were more likely to surrender without a fight. This was actually preferable for the pirates. Fighting was dangerous even when you won. Men could be killed or injured, the ship could be damaged, and cargo could be destroyed in the fighting. If a merchant ship could be persuaded to surrender simply by showing the flag and firing a warning shot, the pirates could take what they wanted without risk. Many pirate articles included specific provisions about how to treat captured enemies. Some crews agreed to offer quarter to anyone who surrendered, meaning they wouldn't be killed or seriously harmed if they gave up without resistance. Others had reputations for showing no mercy, executing entire crews even if they surrendered. Both approaches had strategic value. The promise of fair treatment encouraged surrender, but the reputation for brutality created fear that could paralyze an enemy's will to fight. When merchant ships did resist, the combat could be absolutely savage. Once the pirates closed for boarding, they would throw grappling hooks to secure the ships together, then swarm across onto the enemy deck. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, with pistols firing at point-blank range, cutlasses clashing, axes swinging, and men stabbing with knives and daggers. Pirates had a particular grudge against naval officers and ship's captains who resisted them. If captured after putting up a fight, these authority figures might be subjected to torture and humiliation before being killed. Pirates would sometimes force a captured captain to watch as they divided up his cargo, or make him dance around the mast while they whipped him. This cruelty had multiple purposes. It provided entertainment for the pirate crew, who had been common sailors themselves and harboured deep resentment toward the officers who had once commanded them. It also served as a warning to other captains: surrender immediately or face a terrible fate. The treatment of ordinary captured sailors was usually much better. Pirates often tried to recruit skilled men from captured ships using a combination of persuasion and coercion. They would point out the better conditions aboard a pirate ship, the democratic governance, and the potential for wealth. Many merchant sailors, having just witnessed the pirates' fighting prowess and facing the prospect of being forced to join anyway, signed the articles willingly enough. Those who refused might be set adrift in a small boat or put ashore at the next island, assuming the pirates felt merciful. Some pirates tortured prisoners to make them reveal where valuables were hidden aboard ship. Captains and supercargoes, the merchants who travelled with valuable cargoes to conduct business at ports, might know about secret compartments containing gold, jewels, or other small high-value items. Pirates would use various methods to extract this information, including the thumbscrews, a device that crushed fingers, and the rack, which stretched victims until joints dislocated. Sometimes they would tie a cord around a prisoner's head and twist it tighter with a stick, causing excruciating pain. These torture sessions could go on for hours or days, until the victim either revealed what the pirates wanted to know or died. The myth of walking the plank is mostly fiction. While there are a few historical accounts that might reference something similar, it wasn't a common practice. Pirates had far more efficient ways of killing people. If they wanted someone dead, they would simply shoot them or throw them overboard. The plank idea probably emerged from the mythology that grew up around pirates in the centuries after the Golden Age, added by writers who wanted to create dramatic scenes. Actual punishment methods were quite creative and horrible enough without the plank. Keel hauling involved tying a man to a rope that passed under the ship's keel, then dragging him underneath from one side to the other. If he didn't drown from being underwater, the barnacles covering the ship's hull would shred his flesh like razors. Few men survived keel hauling, and those who did were horribly injured. Marooning meant leaving someone on a deserted island or beach with minimal supplies. Perhaps a bottle of water, a pistol with a single shot, and nothing else. Death would come slowly from thirst, starvation, or exposure, unless the marooned individual chose to use the pistol on himself. Flogging was common, using the cat-o'-nine-tails to stripe a man's back with bloody welts. The punishment was carried out in front of the assembled crew, serving as a warning to others. Severe floggings could leave a man's back a mass of torn flesh that would heal into thick scar tissue. If infection set in, as it often did, the flogging could prove fatal. Some pirate captains were sadistic in their application of punishment, finding excuses to flog men regularly to maintain fear and control. Despite the violence inherent in piracy, combat was actually relatively rare for most pirates. The vast majority of their time was spent sailing, maintaining the ship, and watching the horizon for potential prey. Days or weeks might pass without sighting a worthwhile target. When they did encounter merchant ships, many surrendered without serious resistance once they recognized they were facing pirates. The actual violent combat that fills pirate stories probably occupied less than 1% of a pirate's time. The other 99% was spent preparing for those brief, intense moments or dealing with the consequences afterward. When successful raids did occur and plunder was taken, pirates had to find safe places to rest, repair their ships, sell their stolen goods, and spend their ill-gotten wealth. This need gave rise to pirate havens, port towns where pirates were tolerated or even welcomed despite being outlaws everywhere else. These havens played a crucial role in the pirate economy and became legendary in their own right. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, became the most famous pirate haven during the Golden Age. By 1716, Nassau had become a pirate republic in everything but name. Over 1,000 pirates made the port their home base, far outnumbering the small population of law-abiding settlers. The harbour was perfect for pirate ships, shallow. In Nassau, pirates could beach their ships for careening and repairs without fear of attack. They could sell stolen cargo to merchants who asked no questions about where it came from. They elected their own leader, Benjamin Hornigold, who governed the pirate community with a loose hand while respecting the democratic principles pirates valued. Nassau became a functioning town with its own economy, social structure and culture, all built around piracy. Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny, and dozens of other famous pirates called Nassau home at various times. The atmosphere in Nassau was reportedly wild and lawless. Pirates would come ashore after months at sea with their pockets full of pieces of eight and immediately start spending. Taverns did tremendous business, serving rum by the barrel to men who wanted nothing more than to get roaring drunk after months of hardship. Prostitutes flocked to Nassau, knowing pirates had money and few other outlets for their desires. The streets filled with drunken men staggering from tavern to brothel and back again, punctuated by fights, celebrations, and the occasional duel. Despite the chaos, Nassau had its own rough order. The pirate code extended to behaviour in port, and egregious violations could result in punishment. Theft from fellow pirates was still forbidden, even in Nassau. Men who caused too much trouble might find themselves banned from the community or worse. The pirates recognized that their haven only worked if they maintained enough discipline to prevent it from descending into complete anarchy where no one was safe. Nassau's run as a pirate paradise ended in 1718 when Woodes Rogers arrived as the new royal governor, backed by naval forces and carrying offers of pardons for any pirate who would renounce their criminal life. Many pirates accepted the pardon, having accumulated enough wealth to retire or simply tired of the constant danger. Others, including Charles Vane, refused and sailed away to continue their careers elsewhere. Rogers fortified Nassau, making it into a legitimate town and closing the door on its pirate era. Before Nassau rose to prominence, Tortuga, a small island off the northern coast of Hispaniola, served as the primary base for buccaneers and pirates operating in the Caribbean. The French had established control over Tortuga in the mid-1600s, and the island became a haven for the buccaneers who hunted the wild cattle and pigs that roamed Hispaniola. These hunters gradually transitioned into pirates, using Tortuga as their base. The island was easily defensible, with rocky shores and approaches that made it difficult to attack. Like Nassau, it offered a place where pirates could rest, resupply, and sell their plunder without interference from authorities. Port Royal in Jamaica became another important pirate haven, though its relationship with pirates was more complicated. Port Royal was technically a legitimate English colonial town, but it welcomed pirates with open arms, particularly those holding letters of marque that theoretically made them privateers rather than pirates. The distinction was largely semantic. Privateers were authorized by a government to attack enemy ships, but they used exactly the same methods as pirates, and sometimes attacked whoever they pleased, regardless of their commissions. Port Royal's merchants grew wealthy, buying stolen goods from pirates and selling them supplies. The governor and other officials took bribes to look the other way. The town gained a reputation as the wickedest city on earth, filled with taverns, gambling halls, and brothels catering to pirates' appetites. Port Royal's prosperity came to a dramatic end in June 1692, when a massive earthquake struck, followed by a tsunami. Much of the town sank into the harbour, killing thousands of people. Many saw this as divine judgment for the town's sins, and Port Royal never fully recovered its former glory or its welcoming attitude toward pirates. The destruction of Port Royal and the later cleanup of Nassau forced pirates to seek havens elsewhere, contributing to the decline of Caribbean piracy. What did pirates actually do in these port towns when they came ashore? First and foremost, they drank. After months of rationed water and rum aboard ship, pirates wanted to drink fresh alcohol without limit, and taverns were happy to accommodate. Pirates would sit for hours or days in taverns, drinking themselves into unconsciousness, waking up, and starting over again. The drinking was often communal, with entire crews celebrating together, sharing stories of their adventures, and forging bonds that would hold when they returned to sea. Prostitution was ubiquitous in pirate havens. After months at sea with only male companions, pirates wanted female company, and prostitutes recognized a lucrative market. Some of these women may have been there willingly. Attracted by the money, pirates spent freely. Others had probably been forced into prostitution by poverty, coercion, or enslavement. The relationships between pirates and prostitutes ran the gamut from brief, purely transactional encounters to longer arrangements that resembled relationships, at least for the duration of a ship's time in port. Some pirates formed more lasting attachments to women in port towns. While rare, there are documented cases of pirates marrying and starting families, living as normally as possible when ashore while returning to their criminal profession at sea. Anne Bonny was the daughter of a lawyer and had been married to a small-time pirate before leaving him for Calico Jack Rackham. Mary Red had been married briefly before her husband died, after which she returned to sea. These examples show that at least some women chose to be with pirates, whether for love, adventure, money, or some combination of motivations. Shopping was another major activity in port. Pirates needed to resupply their ships with food, water, gunpowder, weapons, and all the other necessities for life at sea. But they also bought luxury goods for themselves: fine clothes, jewelry, alcohol, and various other items they couldn't get while sailing. Contemporary accounts describe pirates dressed in flamboyant outfits that mixed expensive fabrics with practical sailor's gear, creating a distinctive style. This wasn't just vanity. Pirates understood that appearance mattered. Looking prosperous and dangerous helped with recruiting new crew members and intimidating potential victims. Pirates also sought medical care when in port. Surgeons in port towns could provide better treatment than what was available aboard ship, though medical knowledge was still primitive. Pirates with old wounds that hadn't healed properly, with chronic conditions, or who needed more complex care than a ship's surgeon could provide, would seek out doctors and pay for their services. Some ports had establishments specifically catering to sick and injured sailors, precursors to hospitals, though far less clean and effective than modern medical facilities. The time spent in port was also when pirates sold their stolen goods. They couldn't simply walk into a legitimate merchant's shop and sell obviously stolen cargo without questions being asked. Instead, a network of fences and corrupt merchants handled these transactions, buying stolen goods at a discount and then selling them through legitimate channels. These middlemen made enormous profits from piracy without ever going to sea themselves, and they were essential to the pirate economy. Without them, pirates would have had no way to convert stolen cargo into usable money. Not all of a pirate's shore time was spent in debauchery. Ships needed maintenance that could only be done in port. Careening, the process of beaching a ship and tipping it to expose the hull for cleaning and repairs, required a safe harbour. Pirates would spend days or weeks working on their ship, scraping off barnacles, replacing damaged planks, recaulking seams, and coating the hull with pitch to protect it from shipworms. This was hard, unglamorous work, but it was essential. A ship that wasn't properly maintained would slow down, become less manoeuvrable, and eventually become unseaworthy. The seasonal nature of piracy meant that many pirates spent months ashore during hurricane season. From June through November, the Caribbean was prone to devastating hurricanes that could destroy even the sturdiest ships. Pirates learned to recognize the signs of approaching storms and would seek safe harbor when they could. But being caught at sea in a hurricane was almost always fatal. The smart approach was simply to avoid sailing during the worst months. This meant that piracy was partially a seasonal occupation, with intense activity during the safe sailing months and extended breaks during hurricane season. During these extended stays in port, some pirates made attempts at respectability. They might invest their money in legitimate businesses, buying taverns, shops, or property. A few even managed to transition fully into legitimate life, though this was difficult. The problem was that piracy offered excitement and the potential for wealth that legitimate work simply couldn't match. A pirate who had captured a Spanish treasure ship and walked away with thousands of pieces of eight would find it hard to go back to earning a sailor's wages. Many who tried to go straight eventually returned to piracy, unable to resist the lure of easy money despite knowing the risks. The pirate havens also served as recruitment centers. Young men, hearing tales of pirate adventure and seeing pirates spending money freely, would sign on to cruise. Sometimes they knew exactly what they were getting into. Other times, they had romanticized notions that reality would quickly shatter. The taverns and docks of Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal were where new pirates were born, seduced by stories and the promise of wealth. As much as these havens were important to pirates, they were also vulnerable. They existed only because authorities either couldn't reach them or chose not to interfere. When governments decided to crack down on piracy, the havens were the first targets. Roger's reclamation of Nassau demonstrated how quickly a pirate paradise could be dismantled once authorities committed sufficient resources. Without safe harbours where they could rest, repair, and resupply, pirates found it increasingly difficult to sustain their operations. The end of the major pirate havens coincided with and contributed to the end of the golden age of piracy itself. As governments strengthened their naval presence, offered pardons, and eliminated safe harbours, piracy became progressively more difficult and dangerous. The economics of piracy shifted unfavourably. Where once a successful raid could set up a man for life, now the risks were increasing while the rewards diminished. More and more pirates found themselves hunted, with nowhere safe to run. The ultimate fate of most pirates was violent death, either in battle or on the gallows. Despite the romantic image of pirates retiring rich, the reality was that very few managed to escape their chosen profession alive and free. The combination of naval patrols, pirate hunters, disease, storms, and the inherent dangers of their lifestyle meant that the average pirate's career was measured in months or a few years at most, not decades. When pirates were captured by authorities, they faced trial and almost certain execution. Piracy was a capital crime in every maritime nation, and courts showed little mercy to those convicted. The trial itself was often a formality. The evidence was usually overwhelming. Captured pirates would be identified by their victims, and the stolen goods found aboard their ships left little doubt of their guilt. Some pirates tried to claim they had been forced into service and were innocent victims themselves. This defense sometimes worked, particularly if other crew members testified on their behalf, or if they could prove they had been recently pressed into service. But most convicted pirates knew their fate was sealed. The execution method for pirates was hanging, carried out in public to serve as a warning to others who might consider taking up the pirates' trade. These weren't quick, merciful hangings by modern standards. The condemned pirates would be taken to a gallows erected near the waterfront, where crowds of spectators gathered to watch. Some pirates faced their deaths with defiance, cursing the authorities and declaring they had no regrets. Others broke down in terror, begging for mercy that wouldn't come. A few used their final moments to deliver speeches warning young men not to follow their example, describing the horrors of the pirate's life and urging the crowd to learn from their mistakes. The actual hanging was brutal. Without a proper drop to break the neck and cause instant death, the condemned would be hoisted up slowly, strangling to death as their own body weight cut off their air supply. This could take several agonizing minutes, with the victim thrashing and struggling as they suffocated. Friends or family members sometimes pulled on the legs of the condemned to hasten death and end the suffering more quickly. The bodies were left hanging for hours as a public spectacle, a grim reminder of what awaited those who chose the pirate's life. But death on the gallows wasn't the end for some notorious pirates. Their bodies would be taken down and coated in tar to preserve them, then hung in iron cages called gibbets at prominent points along the shore or at the entrance to harbours. These gibbets would display the corpse for months or years as it slowly decayed, picked apart by birds and rotted by weather. The sight and smell of these gibbet cages served as a powerful deterrent to any sailor considering piracy. The bodies of particularly infamous pirates might be hung in chains at locations where every passing ship would see them. Captain William Kidd's body hung in a gibbet on the Thames River for years after his execution in 1701, visible to thousands of sailors entering and leaving London. Some pirates managed to escape this fate through various means. A few were genuinely pardoned by governments offering amnesty to pirates who would surrender and forswear their criminal ways. The most famous of these amnesty programs was offered by King George I in 1718, promising full pardons to any pirate who surrendered before a specific deadline. Many pirates, including Benjamin Hornigold and hundreds of others in Nassau, accepted these offers. They had accumulated some wealth, were tired of the constant danger, or simply wanted a chance to return to legitimate society. The pardons offered a way out, though authorities sometimes later accused pardoned pirates of returning to piracy and arrested them again. Other pirates avoided capture by dying in battle. This was probably preferable to hanging from the pirate's perspective. Going down fighting meant avoiding the shame and humiliation of public execution. Some pirates seemed to deliberately seek out suicidal last stands when capture appeared inevitable, choosing to die with weapons in their hands rather than face the gibbet. Blackbeard's final battle exemplifies this approach. When Lieutenant Robert Maynard's forces cornered him, Blackbeard fought ferociously despite being heavily outnumbered, sustaining multiple wounds before finally falling dead on the deck. Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head cut off and hung from the bowsprit of his ship as a trophy and proof of the pirate's death. Disease and accidents probably claimed more pirates than battles or executions combined. The constant exposure to tropical diseases, the poor diet lacking in essential nutrients, the dangerous nature of sailing and combat, all of these factors meant that pirates were dying regularly, even during successful careers. A man might survive battles with Spanish warships, only to die from yellow fever in port. He might capture a dozen rich prizes only to fall from the rigging during a storm and drown. He might amass a fortune only to die from an infected wound that a surgeon's crude treatment couldn't heal. A very small number of pirates managed to retire successfully with their wealth intact. These were the truly exceptional cases, men who had the discipline to stop while they were ahead, the cleverness to avoid capture, and the good fortune to survive long enough to enjoy their gains. Henry Morgan is perhaps the most famous example, though whether he counts as a pirate or privateer is debatable. Morgan attacked Spanish colonies and ships under the authority of letters of marque from English authorities, but his actions often exceeded what his commissions permitted. He accumulated enormous wealth through his raids and eventually retired to Jamaica, where he became lieutenant governor and died wealthy and respected, albeit plagued by the health effects of years of hard living. Most pirates harbored dreams of pulling off one big score that would set them up for life, allowing them to retire rich. They fantasized about capturing a Spanish treasure ship loaded with gold and silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico. Such captures did occasionally happen. Bartholomew Roberts captured a Portuguese ship carrying 40,000 golden moidores and numerous diamonds. Henry Avery and his crew captured a Mughal ship carrying an immense treasure, making every crew member wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. These spectacular successes fed the dreams of thousands of other pirates who imagined themselves striking it rich. But for every spectacular success, there were hundreds of raids that yielded disappointing results. Pirates would capture a ship only to discover it carried a cargo of cheap goods like dried fish or timber. Items that were valuable to legitimate merchants but difficult for pirates to sell and not worth much even then. They would split the meagre proceeds among the crew and each man would walk away with a pittance, barely enough to cover a few days of drinking in port. Then they would head back to sea to try again, hoping the next prize would be the big score they dreamed about. The famous pirates whose names we remember today, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Henry Morgan, Calico Jack Rackham, represent a tiny fraction of the total number of men who turned to piracy. For every famous name, there were dozens or hundreds of anonymous pirates whose names are lost to history, men who lived and died without making any significant mark. They were the common crew members, the ordinary sailors who comprised the bulk of pirate ships, who did most of the work and fighting, and who died in battles or from disease without leaving any record beyond perhaps a brief mention in a ship's roster or a court document recording their execution. Even among the famous pirates, few enjoyed their notoriety for long. Blackbeard's reign of terror lasted only about 2 years before he was killed in 1718. Calico Jack Rackham had an even shorter career as a pirate captain, lasting less than 2 years before his capture and execution in 1720. Bartholomew Roberts had one of the longest successful careers, operating for about 4 years and capturing hundreds of ships before being killed in battle with a naval vessel in 1722. Charles Vane was active for about 4 years before being captured and hanged in 17. The reasons for the decline of piracy were multiple and interconnected. Economically, the period following the War of Spanish Succession saw more stable conditions and increased legitimate opportunities for sailors. Men who might have turned pirate during wartime had more options for legal employment. The major naval powers increased their presence in Caribbean waters specifically to combat piracy. More warships patrolling meant pirates had to be more cautious, and it became harder to find safe waters to operate in. The elimination of pirate havens was crucial to piracy's decline. Without places to rest, resupply, and sell stolen goods, pirates found it increasingly difficult to sustain their operations. The reclamation of Nassau, the destruction of Port Royal, and the crackdown on other pirate havens meant pirates had to spend more time at sea and had fewer opportunities to enjoy whatever wealth they accumulated. The economics simply became less favorable. The risks increased while the rewards decreased, making piracy a less attractive proposition. Legal pressure intensified as well. Britain and other nations began offering systematic pardons to pirates willing to surrender, providing an exit strategy for men who wanted out. At the same time, They increased penalties for merchants and officials who collaborated with pirates. The fencers who bought stolen goods, the governors who accepted bribes to look the other way, the merchants who supplied pirate ships, all faced prosecution if caught. This squeezed pirates economically by making it harder to sell stolen cargo and resupply. The ideological justification that some pirates claimed, that they were fighting against tyrannical authority and creating a more just society, rang hollow as the reality of their violence and cruelty became widely known. Whatever democratic principles existed aboard pirate ships, the public saw pirates primarily as murderers and thieves who tortured their victims and disrupted legitimate commerce. The romantic mythology of piracy hadn't yet developed. In the early 1700s, most people saw pirates as criminals who deserved hanging, not as romantic rebels. By the 1730s, the golden age of piracy was effectively over in the Caribbean and along the American coast. A few pirates continued operating in other waters, particularly off the African coast and in the Indian Ocean, but the massive concentrations of pirates that had characterized Nassau and other havens were gone. The age of pirate republics and democratic pirate crews sharing plunder equally had ended. Those pirates who remained were hunted men operating in increasingly difficult conditions. The legacy of this era would prove remarkably durable, however. Within a generation, the brutal reality of pirate life began to be obscured by romantic mythology. Books like A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 and attributed to Captain Charles Johnson, presented dramatic and partly fictionalized accounts of famous pirates that emphasized adventure over the grim reality. This process of romanticization would continue for centuries, through novels, plays, and eventually films that turned pirates from criminals into heroes. The real pirates would probably be amazed and perhaps amused by their transformation into romantic figures. The men who lived with rats and weevils, who watched their crewmates die from scurvy and dysentery, who risked hanging for the chance at wealth they usually never achieved. These men might not recognize themselves in the swashbuckling adventurers of fiction. The democratic principles that governed pirate ships were born of necessity, not idealism. The relative equality in sharing plunder reflected the reality that a crew would mutiny if they felt cheated, not any principled belief in economic justice. Yet there were elements of the pirate's life that were genuinely remarkable for their time. The democratic governance of pirate ships, the election of officers, the written articles that served as social contracts. These represented experiments in self-governance that were radical for the early 18th century. The racial and ethnic mixing aboard pirate ships, while born of necessity, created communities that were far more diverse than most legitimate institutions of the era. The injury compensation that provided for disabled pirates showed a form of social welfare that was more generous than what sailors could expect in naval or merchant service. But there was also an element of genuine attraction to the freedom that piracy represented. For all its hardships, pirate life offered a degree of autonomy that was almost impossible to find in legitimate 18th century society. A pirate had a voice in decisions that affected his life. He shared equally in the fruits of his labor, at least in theory. He wasn't subject to the arbitrary authority of officers who could order him flogged on a whim. For men who had spent their lives being ordered around by people they despised, working for wages that barely kept them alive, the pirate's life offered something precious, the chance to be free, even if that freedom came with a heavy cost. The religious attitudes of pirates varied widely, but many seem to have maintained at least nominal Christian beliefs despite their criminal lifestyle. Some pirate articles forbade bringing women aboard, but said nothing about religious observance, suggesting it wasn't a major concern. Others included provisions requiring men to respect the Sabbath or forbidding gambling on Sundays. Bartholomew Roberts, unusually pious for a pirate, forbade work or gaming on Sundays. ordering his men to keep holy the Sabbath day. The music and dancing that pirates enjoyed often included hymns and psalms alongside bawdy sea shanties. Some pirates seemed to view their lifestyle as incompatible with salvation and lived with a sense of fatalism about their ultimate fate. They knew they were going to hell, or so they believed, and embraced a philosophy of living for the moment since they were already damned. This attitude fed into the reckless, hedonistic behavior that characterized pirate life in port. If you're going to be hanged and damned anyway, you might as well drink and spend with abandon. Others maintained hope for divine forgiveness. When facing execution, many pirates made speeches expressing repentance for their crimes and warning others not to follow their example. How much of this was genuine contrition and how much was performance for the crowd is impossible to say. Some condemned pirates probably did sincerely regret their choices in their final moments. Others may have been playing to the crowd, saying what was expected of them while inwardly remaining unrepentant. The superstitions common among sailors generally were amplified among pirates. Many believed in various omens and signs that predicted good or bad fortune. Whistling aboard ship might summon winds. A silver coin placed under the mast when it was first stepped would bring good luck to the vessel. Women aboard ship brought bad luck, which partly explains why they were forbidden, despite the obvious desire many pirates had for female company. Starting a voyage on a Friday was unlucky. Seeing a priest before sailing was bad luck, as was seeing someone with red hair. These superstitions provided a sense of control over the uncontrollable, a way to explain random chance and impose meaning on the chaos of life at sea. Pirates also believed in ghosts and spirits, as did most people of their era. Ships that had seen violent deaths were said to be haunted. Pirates who died at sea might return as ghosts to haunt their former crewmates, especially if they had been killed unjustly. Some pirates believed that the spirits of executed pirates lingered around the gibbets where their bodies were displayed, warning away potential recruits or seeking vengeance on those who had betrayed them. These ghost stories were told and retold aboard ship during long voyages, becoming part of the shared culture that bound crews together. The relationships between pirates and the various colonial powers were complex and constantly shifting. During wartime, European powers issued letters of marque that authorized privateers to attack enemy ships. These privateers were essentially legal pirates, sanctioned by their governments to commit acts that would be piracy in peacetime. The line between privateer and pirate was always blurry. A privateer might attack ships from neutral nations, exceeding his commission and becoming a pirate in practice, if not in name. When wars ended and letters of marque were revoked, many privateers simply continued operating as pirates, having no other trade and seeing no reason to stop. Spain, which still claimed most of the Caribbean and Central and South America, was the primary target of many pirates. Spanish ships carrying silver and gold from the New World to Europe were the richest prizes available. Spanish colonial towns, often wealthy but poorly defended, were tempting targets for pirate raids. The Spanish responded by fortifying their ports and organizing their merchant ships into convoys protected by warships. This made attacking Spanish targets more difficult and dangerous, but the potential rewards were so great that pirates continued to try. As European colonial governments strengthened their control and developed more robust economies, their tolerance for piracy decreased. Pirates disrupted legitimate trade, which hurt colonial revenues. They created diplomatic incidents when they attacked ships from allied nations. They threatened the stability of colonial ports where they congregated. The calculation shifted from seeing pirates as useful irregular forces to viewing them as threats that needed to be eliminated. This policy shift was crucial in ending the golden age of piracy. The international nature of pirate crews created interesting dynamics. A crew might include English, French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, African, and Native American members, men who would have been enemies on land united by their common criminal enterprise. This diversity required a degree of tolerance and cooperation that was unusual for the era. Pirates developed a cosmopolitan culture that transcended national and ethnic boundaries, held together by shared experiences and the common goal of enriching themselves through theft. Language aboard pirate ships must have been chaotic, with crew members speaking different languages and dialects. English emerged as a common language since many pirates operated in Caribbean waters dominated by English colonial powers. But multilingual crews were common. This linguistic diversity probably contributed to the development of pirate slang and jargon, as crews created hybrid vocabularies drawing from multiple languages. Some of the colourful language we associate with pirates, nautical terms mixed with slang from various languages, emerged from this multilingual environment. The clothing and appearance of pirates was more practical than popular culture suggests. While pirates who had captured rich prizes might spend money on fine clothing, the typical pirate's wardrobe was functional sailor's gear designed for life at sea. Loose-fitting trousers or slops, loose shirts and headscarves or hats to protect from sun were standard. Many pirates went barefoot aboard ship, as shoes could be slippery on wet decks. The flamboyant pirate captains who dressed in expensive coats and hats were the exception rather than the rule, and even they probably saved such finery for going ashore or trying to impress during negotiations. The famous pirate earrings did have some basis in reality. Sailors, including pirates, often wore gold earrings, though the reasons varied. Some believed gold earrings improved eyesight, a superstition with no medical basis but which persisted nonetheless. Others wore them as portable wealth that could be used to pay for a proper burial if they died in a foreign port. The gold could be sold or used directly to purchase funeral services, ensuring the sailor wouldn't end up in an unmarked pauper's grave. This was a legitimate concern for men who might die far from home with no one to care for their bodies. Tattoos were less common among pirates than later sailor culture would suggest. Tattooing techniques existed, and some sailors acquired tattoos in various ports. But the elaborate tattooing we associate with sailor culture developed more in the 19th century. Pirates of the Golden Age would have had some tattoos, likely simple designs applied by fellow crew members using improvised tools. But the full-body tattoos of later maritime tradition hadn't yet emerged. The impact of piracy on legitimate commerce was significant. Merchants faced increased costs due to the need for larger crews to defend their ships, armament to fight off pirates, insurance against pirate attacks, and the delays caused by sailing in convoys rather than individually. Some shipping routes became too dangerous to use regularly. The price of goods transported through pirate-infested waters increased as merchants passed their costs on to consumers. The overall effect was to slow trade and increase costs, hurting colonial economies and creating pressure on governments to eliminate the pirate threat. Individual merchants who lost ships and cargo to pirates could be financially ruined. Insurance helped spread the risk, but insurance itself was expensive and didn't cover all losses. A merchant who had borrowed money to finance a cargo that was then captured by pirates might end up in debtor's prison, unable to repay his creditors. The human cost of piracy extended beyond the obvious violence to include these financial victims who never encountered pirates directly, but suffered from their actions nonetheless. The passengers aboard captured ships, often wealthy merchants, colonial officials, or their families, faced different dangers. Pirates usually refrained from killing passengers unless they resisted, or the pirates needed to make an example. But passengers would be robbed of all their possessions, sometimes even their clothing. Women passengers faced the additional threat of sexual assault, though accounts of actual rape are relatively rare in the historical record. Pirates seem to recognize that routinely raping female passengers would steel resistance and ensure that future victims would fight to the death rather than surrender. Still, The threat was always present, and the psychological trauma of being captured by pirates, even when physical harm was limited, must have been severe. The judicial process for captured pirates evolved over time. Early in the Golden Age, pirates had to be transported back to England for trial in admiralty courts, which was expensive and time-consuming. Later, colonial courts were given authority to try pirates locally, speeding up the process and allowing for quicker executions that served as more immediate warnings. The trials themselves were often rushed affairs with predetermined outcomes. The evidence was usually overwhelming, witnesses plentiful, and the mood of the court unsympathetic. Defense attorneys, when they existed at all, could do little to help their clients. Mass executions of captured pirate crews became public spectacles. When Charles Vane's crew was captured, dozens of men were tried together, and many were hanged on the same day. When Bartholomew Roberts' crew was captured after his death, over 70 men were eventually hanged, while others were transported as slaves to work in colonial plantations. These mass executions served multiple purposes. They eliminated large numbers of pirates at once, they provided spectacular warnings to potential pirates, and they satisfied public demand for revenge against men seen as violent criminals. The treatment of captured pirates varied by nationality and circumstance. English pirates captured by English authorities could expect trial and likely execution. But what happened when English pirates were captured by Spanish authorities, or French pirates by English authorities? International law regarding piracy was still developing, and the treatment of foreign pirates was inconsistent. Sometimes they were executed regardless of nationality, under the principle that pirates were hostis humani generis, enemies of all mankind, and could be punished by any nation that caught them. Other times, captured pirates might be used as bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations, or held prisoner, rather than executed. The families of pirates faced their own difficulties. A pirate's wife and children might not have known his true occupation, believing he was a legitimate sailor away at sea. When he was captured and executed, they lost not only their husband and father, but also any financial support he had been providing. Some pirate wives knew their husband's true profession and lived with the constant fear of his capture. A few wives apparently embraced the pirate lifestyle themselves, like Anne Bonny, who joined Calico Jack's crew and fought alongside the men. The children of pirates grew up with significant social stigma. Having a father who had been hanged as a pirate marked a family for generations. The children might struggle to find legitimate work or marriage prospects due to their father's crimes. Some probably kept their family history secret, reinventing themselves and their family background to escape the shame. Others may have followed their fathers into criminal life, seeing it as their only option given the stigma they faced. The economic impact on pirate havens when they were cleaned up was significant. Towns like Nassau that had built their economies around servicing pirates suddenly lost their primary source of income. The tavern owners, merchants, prostitutes, and others who had profited from pirate spending had to find new sources of revenue or relocate. Some transitioned to servicing legitimate maritime trade, while others abandoned the ports entirely. The boom and bust cycle of pirate haven economies created instability and hardship for civilian populations caught up in the pirate economy. The naval officers and sailors who hunted pirates were motivated by a mix of duty, reward money, and personal ambition. Governments offered substantial bounties for captured pirates, and naval officers who successfully eliminated pirate threats could advance their careers significantly. Lieutenant Robert Maynard became famous for killing Blackbeard and was rewarded financially. Woodes Rogers earned a knighthood for his success in eliminating piracy from Nassau. This created the actual naval battles between pirate ships and naval vessels could be surprisingly brief. Naval ships typically had disciplined crews trained in combat, while pirate crews, though experienced fighters, might be less coordinated. Naval ships usually had more guns and heavier firepower. When a pirate ship encountered a determined naval force, the smart move was to run if possible. Many pirates did exactly that, using their knowledge of local waters and their ships' shallow drafts to escape into areas where deeper naval vessels couldn't follow. But when escape wasn't possible, the battles could be fierce. The tactics of naval pirate hunters evolved as they learned from experience. They discovered that approaching pirate ships under false colours allowed them to get close before revealing their true identity. They learned that attacking at dawn, when many pirates might still be drunk or hungover from the night before, increased their chances of success. They developed intelligence networks of informers who would report pirate movements in exchange for money or pardons. These improved tactics made pirate hunting more effective and piracy more dangerous. Some former pirates became pirate hunters themselves, using their knowledge of pirate tactics and haven locations to track down their former colleagues. Benjamin Hornigold accepted a pardon and then worked for Woodes Rogers, hunting pirates who had refused the amnesty offer. This betrayal of former comrades was seen as particularly treacherous by pirates who remained active, and Hornigold reportedly lived in fear of revenge. The phenomenon of turned pirates created paranoia within pirate ranks, as crews worried about who might betray them in exchange for a pardon or reward money. The propaganda war against pirates was waged through broadsides, newspapers, and sermons. Colonial authorities wanted to discourage piracy by emphasizing its dangers and moral depravity. Accounts of pirate captures and executions were published widely, describing the pirates' crimes in lurid detail and depicting their execution as just punishment. Ministers preached sermons condemning piracy as a sin that led to damnation. Ballads and poems about executed pirates served as cautionary tales, warning young men away from the pirate's life. This sustained propaganda campaign shaped public opinion and made it increasingly difficult for pirates to recruit new members or find sympathizers. The intelligence about merchant ship movements and cargoes that pirates needed to operate effectively came from various sources. Sailors in port taverns might gossip about which ships were loading valuable cargo. Corrupt officials might sell information about ship schedules and routes. Pirates themselves, when capturing ships, would interrogate captains and crew about what other vessels they had seen and where. This intelligence network was informal but effective, allowing pirates to position themselves along routes where rich prizes were likely to appear. The navigation skills required for successful piracy were considerable. Pirates needed to know not just how to sail from point A to point B, but how to predict where merchant ships would be, how to use currents and winds to intercept them, and how to escape into shallow waters when pursued. The best pirate navigators were worth their weight in gold to their crews. These men could read the sky, the water, and the charts to position their ship where it needed to be. Without skilled navigation, a pirate ship would waste weeks sailing empty waters, while merchant ships passed safely elsewhere. The actual process of careening a ship reveals much about the labour-intensive nature of piracy. The ship had to be sailed close to shore at high tide, then anchored as the tide receded, gradually beaching the vessel. The crew would then tip the ship onto its side by removing weight from one side and adding it to the other, or by using ropes attached to masts and anchors on shore to pull the ship over. With half the hull exposed, the crew would spend days scraping away barnacles, seaweed, and accumulated growth, then coat the clean hull with a mixture of tallow, sulfur, and pitch to protect against shipworms and slow new growth. Then the entire process had to be repeated for the other side of the hull. All of this had to be done while vulnerable to attack, making it necessary to post guards and work as quickly as possible. The maintenance of a wooden ship was truly never-ending. In addition to careening, there was constant caulking to replace the oakum that sealed gaps between planks. Ropes wore out and had to be spliced or replaced entirely. Sails developed tears and holes that needed patching. The masts and spars could crack or split and required repair or replacement. Pumps that removed bilge water from the hold needed constant attention. A ship that wasn't properly maintained would literally fall apart. Planks separating, masts collapsing, and leaks opening everywhere. The fact that pirate ships remained seaworthy, despite the challenging conditions, speaks to the skill and hard work of pirate crews. The role of luck in a pirate's life cannot be overstated. A slight change in wind direction might mean the difference between capturing a rich prize or losing it. Being in one location rather than another when a storm struck could determine whether a ship survived or sank. Having a skilled surgeon aboard when someone was badly wounded could mean the difference between recovery and death. Encountering a naval patrol one day earlier or later might mean capture or escape. Pirates recognized the role of chance and developed fatalistic attitudes. They couldn't control whether they would be lucky or unlucky, so they focused on being prepared for whatever fortune brought their way. The psychology of violence that pirates had to develop is worth considering. Most humans have deep inhibitions against killing other humans. Soldiers are trained extensively to overcome these inhibitions. Pirates had to do the same, learning to kill when necessary, while maintaining enough control to not murder indiscriminately. The brutality that pirates sometimes displayed, the torture of prisoners, the casual killing, suggests that some became desensitized to violence and even began to enjoy it. Others probably never fully adjusted and carried psychological scars from the violence they witnessed and committed. The end of a pirate's career, when it came, was usually sudden. One day, he was a free man making his own choices. The next, he was captured, in chains, awaiting execution. Or he was fighting one moment and lying dead on a bloody deck the next. The uncertainty must have been psychologically corrosive. Every sail on the horizon could be either a prize or a threat. Every port might welcome you or betray you to authorities. Living with that level of uncertainty required either remarkable mental toughness or a kind of fatalistic acceptance that whatever happened was beyond your control. In the final analysis, the reality of pirate life during the Golden Age was a far cry from the romantic adventures depicted in modern entertainment. It was a life of grinding hardship, punctuated by brief moments of violence and even briefer periods of celebration. It was months of boring routine, followed by hours of terrifying combat. It was disease, malnutrition, and chronic pain accepted as normal. It was watching friends die in horrible ways and knowing you would likely die the same way. It was betrayal and violence and desperate struggle for survival in a world where the odds were stacked against you. Yet men continued to choose this life, or at least acquiesce to it when pressed into service. The reasons remain complex and varied with each individual, but common themes emerge. The desire for wealth and the belief that one more prize would be the big score. The taste of freedom, however illusory, from the rigid hierarchies and brutal discipline of legitimate society. The camaraderie of the crew, the bonds forged through shared danger that became stronger than family ties. The excitement of a life lived at the edge, where every day might be your last, so every day mattered intensely. The pirate's life was ultimately unsustainable. It existed in the spaces between effective governmental authority, in the power vacuum created by colonial expansion outpacing administrative control. As governments strengthened, as naval forces grew, as colonies developed functioning economies and robust institutions, the space for piracy shrank. The pirate havens fell one by one. The famous pirates were captured or killed. The ordinary pirates faced increasingly long odds and diminishing returns. By the mid-1700s, the golden age of piracy was a memory, though piracy itself never fully disappeared. Pirates would continue operating in various forms into the modern era, but never again with the scope and impact of the Golden Age. The democratic pirate republics, the great concentrations of pirate ships in Caribbean havens, the bold raids on colonial towns. These became history, then legend, then myth. The reality was forgotten or deliberately obscured, replaced by romanticized versions that bore little resemblance to the truth. The men who lived as pirates during the Golden Age left few personal accounts of their experiences. Most were illiterate or semi-literate, and those who could write had little reason to document their crimes. Our knowledge comes primarily from court records, the accounts of their victims, reports from colonial officials, and sensationalized contemporary accounts that mixed fact and fiction. This fragmentary, biased record makes it challenging to fully reconstruct the lived experience of piracy. We can outline the conditions, describe the violence and hardship, analyze the systems and social structures. But the subjective experience, what it felt like to live that life, remains partly inaccessible across the centuries. What we can say with confidence is that the pirate's life was brutally hard in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. The physical discomfort alone, the constant dampness, the terrible food, the endless itching from lice and other parasites, the lack of sleep, the aching muscles from hard labor, would break many people. Add to that the constant threat of disease, the danger of combat, the psychological stress of living as an outlaw, and the near certainty of a violent death, and the pirate's life becomes almost incomprehensible as a voluntary choice. Yet they made that choice. Thousands of men across dozens of years. And in doing so, they created a culture that has fascinated people ever since. Their ships became floating experiments in democracy at a time when democracy was almost unknown. Their articles of agreement were social contracts that distributed power and wealth more equally than most legitimate institutions. Their multicultural crews transcended boundaries that divided people on land. These progressive elements existed alongside brutal violence, criminal behavior, and moral depravity, creating a complex legacy that resists simple categorization. The pirates of the Golden Age were neither the noble rebels of romantic fiction nor the one-dimensional villains of morality tales. They were desperate men, ambitious men, violent men, clever men, brave men, cruel men. They were products of their time, shaped by poverty, violence, and rigid social hierarchies that offered them few opportunities for advancement through legitimate means. They chose or accepted a life that offered freedom, adventure, and potential wealth at the cost of almost certain death. They created systems and cultures that were in some ways more progressive than legitimate society, while simultaneously engaging in acts of shocking brutality. The world that created the Golden Age of piracy no longer exists. The combination of weak colonial governance, active warfare between European powers, abundant merchant traffic, and available safe havens created conditions perfect for piracy. When those conditions changed, piracy declined. But the fascination with pirates has only grown over the centuries since. We've transformed them from criminals into cultural icons, from men who tortured and murdered into lovable rogues seeking adventure. This transformation says more about our own needs and desires than about the historical reality. Perhaps what draws us to pirate stories is the fantasy of absolute freedom, of escaping social constraints and living by our own rules. In an increasingly regulated, controlled modern world, the idea of sailing away to make our own destiny has obvious appeal. We ignore or minimize the terrible costs of that freedom because we want to believe it's possible to escape without consequences. The reality that freedom from social constraints also means freedom from social support, that living outside the law means living in constant danger, that liberty without structure descends into chaos, doesn't fit the fantasy we prefer. The legacy of the Golden Age of piracy is thus paradoxical. The actual pirates lived difficult, brutal, usually short lives, dying in violence or disease far from home, leaving little behind except victims and legends. Yet their impact on culture has been enormous and enduring. They demonstrated that alternatives to rigid hierarchy were possible. They showed that ordinary men could govern themselves through democratic processes. They proved that racial and ethnic differences could be overcome when necessary. These demonstrations came wrapped in violence and criminality, but the lessons remained after the violence faded from memory. In the end, what was it really like to be a pirate? It was hard. It was dangerous. It was often boring, punctuated by moments of intense terror and violence. It was living with constant physical discomfort, hunger, thirst, pain, exhaustion as your normal state. It was watching friends die and knowing you would probably die the same way soon. It was brief moments of triumph and celebration, followed by long stretches of privation and struggle. It was freedom from authority coupled with submission to the harsh tyranny of the sea itself. The daily reality was one of endless work. Even when no enemy ships appeared on the horizon, there was always something that needed doing aboard ship. Sails to mend, ropes to splice, decks to swab, pumps to man, food to prepare, watches to stand. The work was physically exhausting and never truly finished. As soon as one task was completed, another demanded attention. In this respect, the pirate's life wasn't dramatically different from that of any sailor. The sea demanded constant labour from those who travelled upon it. What distinguished pirate life was the awareness that you were living outside the law, that capture meant death, that you could trust no one except your immediate crewmates, and sometimes not even them. This created a peculiar psychology, a mixture of fatalism and fierce loyalty. Pirates knew they were doomed men who had chosen a path that led almost inevitably to violent death. This knowledge shaped how they lived. Why save money for a future you probably wouldn't have? Why deny yourself pleasures when tomorrow you might be dead? The intensity with which pirates celebrated when they had the chance reflected their awareness that opportunities for joy were rare and fleeting. The smell of a pirate ship must have been overwhelming. Hundreds of unwashed men living in close quarters, with primitive sanitation, food rotting in storage, bilge water sloshing in the hold, gunpowder residue, tar, and the ever-present salt smell of the ocean. All of this combined into a stench that contemporary observers frequently commented on. Pirates probably became nose-blind to it after a while, no longer noticing what would make a landlubber gag. But the smell was so pervasive that it clung to everything. Even after bathing and changing clothes in port, a pirate probably still carried the ship's stench with him. The sounds aboard ship created a constant backdrop to pirate life. The creaking of timbers as the ship moved through water, the snap of canvas sails catching wind, the rhythmic splashing of waves against the hull, the cries of seabirds, the groaning of ropes under strain, and the voices of men calling to each other. These sounds became so familiar that their absence would probably have been unsettling. During storms, the sounds became terrifying, with wood screaming under stress, the roar of wind, the crash of waves, and sometimes the snapping sound of a mast breaking. Sleep aboard ship was difficult under the best conditions. The constant motion, the noise, the discomfort of the hammock, the proximity of other men, all of this made truly restful sleep rare. Many pirates probably existed in a state of chronic sleep deprivation, catching a few hours here and there, but never getting the deep, restful sleep that the body needs. This exhaustion made them irritable and affected judgment, contributing to the sudden explosions of violence that could occur over minor disputes. The relationship between pirates and time was different from modern experience. Without reliable clocks, timekeeping aboard ship depended on sandglasses that had to be turned regularly, on observation of the sun and stars, and on the ship's bell that marked the watches. The passage of days blurred together when there was no particular reason to distinguish one from another. Pirates might lose track of what day of the week it was, or even what month. Time was measured by voyages and raids rather than by calendar dates. This timelessness could be disorienting, contributing to the sense of existing outside normal society. The concept of home held different meanings for different pirates. Some maintained connections to specific places on land where they had families or property. They thought of themselves as temporarily at sea, planning to return home eventually. Others had burned their bridges completely and had no home except the ship itself. These men were psychologically homeless, belonging nowhere on land, truly adopting the ship as their only home. This created different motivations and different levels of desperation. A man with a home to return to might be more cautious, more willing to accept a pardon and retire. A man with nowhere to go had less to lose. The medical understanding of the era meant that pirates had no idea what was actually wrong when they fell ill. The symptoms were obvious: fever, pain, bleeding, swelling. But the causes remained mysterious. Without germ theory, without knowledge of vitamins and nutrition, without understanding of how diseases spread, pirates were essentially helpless before the illnesses that plagued them. They could see the symptoms and suffer through them, but they couldn't understand or prevent them. This medical ignorance contributed to a sense of powerlessness in the face of disease that modern people, with their understanding of medicine, struggle to comprehend. The literacy levels among pirates varied, but were generally low. Many pirates were completely illiterate, unable to read or write their own names. They would sign articles and other documents with an X or a simple mark. This meant they depended on the few literate members of the crew to read and write for them. The quartermaster typically needed to be literate to keep records of plunder and distributions. The navigator needed to read charts and pilot books. But common crew members were often illiterate, which limited their ability to record their own experiences and contributed to the scarcity of first-hand pirate accounts. The few pirates who were literate often came from slightly higher social backgrounds before turning to piracy. They might have been clerks, merchants' sons, or had some other position that required education. These men were valuable to pirate crews for their skills beyond simple literacy. They could forge documents, read legal papers taken from captured ships, keep accounts, and handle negotiations when needed. Some became quartermasters or captains, partly based on their literacy and numeracy skills. The concept of personal property among pirates was complex. The pirate articles specified that major plunder would be divided according to the agreed-upon shares. But what about smaller items taken during raids? What about personal possessions like clothing, weapons, or items of sentimental value? Different ships handled this differently, but generally pirates were allowed to keep personal items and small valuables they had acquired, as long as they weren't trying to hide major treasure from the common stock. This created a grey area, where some pirates tried to cheat their crewmates by concealing valuable items, leading to accusations and conflicts. The weapons maintenance required by pirates was considerable. Firearms of the era required constant care to remain functional. Moisture from the sea air would cause metal to rust if not regularly cleaned and oiled. Gunpowder had to be kept dry, which was challenging aboard a ship where moisture was everywhere. The flints in flintlock mechanisms wore out and had to be replaced. Blades needed sharpening. A pirate who didn't maintain his weapons properly might find them useless when he needed them most, possibly costing him his life. The training that turned men into effective pirates was informal but intensive. New recruits learned by watching and doing, under the supervision of experienced pirates who would teach them the necessary skills. How to handle weapons, how to board an enemy ship, how to spot potential prizes, how to read the signs of approaching weather. All of this knowledge was passed down through demonstration and practice. Some pirates became experts in particular skills. Gunners who could aim cannons with devastating accuracy. helmsmen who could coax maximum speed from a ship, lookouts with eyes sharp enough to identify ships at incredible distances. The relationship between pirates and religious institutions was complex. Many pirates had been raised Christian and retained some religious beliefs, even while living in violation of Christian teachings. They might pray during storms or before battles, seeking divine protection, even while knowing they were damned for their crimes. Some pirate havens had churches, and at least some pirates attended services when in port, perhaps from habit or from genuine spiritual need. The clergy generally condemned pirates as sinners beyond redemption, but occasionally ministers would visit condemned pirates in their final days, hearing confessions and offering what spiritual comfort they could. The impact of isolation from normal society affected different pirates in different ways. Some thrived on being outsiders, embracing their outlaw status, and feeling superior to the law-abiding people they victimized. Others felt the isolation acutely and longed for reconciliation with society. They might fantasize about somehow making amends, earning a pardon, and returning to legitimate life. The awareness that they could never truly return home, that they were cut off from family and old friends, could be psychologically devastating. Some pirates drank heavily, partly to numb this emotional pain. The evolution of a pirate's moral sense is worth considering. Most pirates probably started with relatively normal moral frameworks. They knew stealing and killing were wrong. But the longer they engaged in piracy, the more these moral inhibitions eroded. They developed justifications for their actions. The merchants they robbed were rich and could afford the losses. The naval officers they killed had been brutal tyrants who deserved death. They were only taking what they needed to survive. These rationalizations allowed them to continue functioning psychologically, despite committing acts they once would have condemned. Some pirates seemed to retain a sense of honor, even while engaging in dishonorable activities. They would keep their word when they gave it, at least to other pirates. They would follow the articles strictly even when cheating would have been easy. They would show mercy to defeated enemies who had fought bravely. This selective honor code suggests that pirates weren't simply amoral criminals, but rather had developed their own ethical frameworks that differed from, but weren't entirely divorced from, conventional morality. The phenomenon of pirate nicknames reveals something about their culture. Many pirates went by colorful names: Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Black Bart, Long Ben. These nicknames served practical purposes, helping to conceal their real identities and making them harder to track if they wanted to return to legitimate society. But they also served psychological purposes, creating personas that were larger than life. A man named Edward Teach might feel fear, but Blackbeard was fearless. The nickname created a barrier between the person and the role, allowing pirates to perform violence and cruelty while maintaining some separation between their actions and their core identity. The gambling that was such a prominent feature of pirate culture served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. It provided a way to pass the time during long voyages. It created hierarchies of winners and losers that had nothing to do with fighting skill or sailing ability, giving men who weren't physically dominant a way to gain status. It also served as a form of wealth redistribution, as winners and losers changed constantly, preventing any individual from accumulating too much personal wealth that might tempt them to desert with their fortune. The dreams and nightmares that pirates experienced probably reflected their daily realities. Dreams of home and family for those who had left loved ones behind. Nightmares of drowning, of being caught and hanged, of battles gone wrong. Some pirates may have been haunted by the faces of people they had killed or tortured, appearing in their dreams to accuse them. Others may have dreamed of the big score that would change everything, of ships laden with gold just waiting to be captured. These nocturnal fantasies and terrors were private experiences that went largely unrecorded, but must have been psychologically significant. The reality of pirate democracy, as opposed to the idealized version, included significant problems. Decisions made by vote weren't always wise. The crew might vote to pursue a prize that was actually too well defended, leading to disaster. They might vote to spare an enemy who would later betray them. Democratic decision-making could be painfully slow when speed was essential. The compromise required to achieve consensus might produce half measures that satisfied no one. Despite these problems, pirates generally preferred their democratic system to the alternative of authoritarian captains, suggesting that the benefits outweighed the drawbacks. The moments of genuine camaraderie and fellowship that developed among pirate crews were probably real and meaningful. Men who faced death together, who depended on each other for survival, who shared their plunder and their hardships. These experiences created bonds that could be stronger than family ties. Pirates would risk their lives to save wounded crewmates. They would seek revenge for pirates who were killed by enemies. The found family of the pirate crew provided emotional support and identity that many pirates had never experienced elsewhere. This makes the betrayals, when they occurred, even more devastating. The treatment of animals aboard pirate ships varied. Live animals brought aboard as food sources, chickens, pigs, goats, were kept alive as long as possible, but their ultimate fate was the cooking pot. Some pirates probably developed affection for these animals, despite knowing they would eventually eat them. Rats and other vermin were universally hated and killed whenever possible. Seabirds were sometimes kept as pets or for entertainment. Cats might be kept aboard to control rats, and some pirates probably developed genuine fondness for the ship's cats. The presence of animals provided a connection to the natural world that was otherwise absent in the wooden world of the ship. The final moments of dying pirates varied enormously. Some died instantly in battle, killed by a pistol ball or cutlass stroke before they knew what hit them. Others died slowly from wounds, bleeding out, or succumbing to infection over days or weeks of agony. Disease killed some gradually, their bodies breaking down until organs failed. Drowning was probably the most common cause of death for pirates who fell overboard. Some pirates faced execution with courage, others with terror. The variety of deaths reflected the variety of men who became pirates. Each one ended his story differently, but few ended it in comfort or old age. The contributions of women to pirate culture, beyond the famous few who actually sailed as pirates, deserve mention. Women in port towns provided essential services. They ran taverns and brothels. They laundered clothes, they cooked food, they nursed the sick and injured. Without these supporting roles, pirate havens couldn't have functioned. Some women probably were wives or lovers of specific pirates, providing emotional support and maintaining connections to conventional society. Others were simply businesswomen who recognized an economic opportunity and took advantage of it. Their stories are largely lost to history, but they were integral to the pirate ecosystem. The question of whether pirates were revolutionaries or simply criminals has been debated by historians. The democratic organization of pirate ships, the relative equality in wealth distribution, the multiracial composition of crews, these elements seem progressive and revolutionary. But pirates weren't motivated by ideology or a desire to change society. They were pursuing their own self-interest in whatever way worked. The progressive aspects of pirate society emerged from. The environmental knowledge that successful pirates needed was considerable. They had to understand weather patterns, ocean currents, the behaviors of fish and birds that indicated proximity to land, the appearance of water that suggested shallow or deep channels, the types of flora and fauna found on different islands. This knowledge was accumulated through experience and passed down from older to younger pirates. Men who grew up in coastal communities might arrive with some of this knowledge, while those from inland areas had to learn everything from scratch. The learning curve was steep, and mistakes could be fatal. The economic calculations that went into deciding whether to attack a particular ship were complex. Was the potential cargo valuable enough to justify the risk? Was the ship sufficiently undermanned or poorly armed that it could be taken without too much danger? Would capturing this ship put the pirates in a position where they were likely to encounter naval patrols? Would the time spent chasing this prize mean missing another opportunity? Pirates had to make these calculations quickly, based on limited information, knowing that wrong decisions could lead to disaster. The successful pirate captains were those who consistently made good judgments about which fights to pick. The transition from legitimate sailor to pirate wasn't always dramatic. Some men simply found themselves serving aboard a ship that turned pirate, either through the crew's collective decision or by being captured and pressed into service. Others made conscious decisions to join pirate crews after hearing recruitment pitches in taverns. A few actively sought out pirates, determined to pursue that life, but for many, the transition was gradual and almost accidental. A series of small compromises and decisions that eventually left them firmly on the wrong side of the law with no easy way back. The regrets that pirates felt probably varied as much as the men themselves. Some regretted leaving families behind or burning bridges that couldn't be rebuilt. Others regretted specific acts of violence or cruelty that haunted them. Some regretted the lost opportunities for legitimate advancement they had turned away from. Others seemed to have no regrets at all, embracing their choices and accepting the consequences. The condemned pirates who made speeches warning others away from piracy may have been genuinely regretful, or they may have been performing expected roles in exchange for the slim hope of last-minute pardons that rarely came. The sensory deprivation that pirates experience during long voyages is worth noting. After weeks at sea, with nothing to look at except water, sky, and the ship itself, with limited variety in sounds, with terrible food providing little pleasure, the senses became starved for stimulation. This might partly explain the intensity with which pirates embraced sensory experiences when they reached port: the bright colours, the varied foods, the music, the touch of other human bodies. After deprivation came overwhelming sensory indulgence, swinging from one extreme to the other. The philosophical questions about freedom and authority that pirate life embodied were probably not explicitly articulated by the pirates themselves. They weren't philosophers or political theorists, but their lived experience raised important questions. Can free men govern themselves without external authority? How much inequality can a society tolerate before it breaks apart? What obligations do individuals have to the collective, and vice versa? When is violence justified, and who gets to decide? Pirates provided practical demonstrations of alternative answers to these questions, even if they never formulated the questions explicitly. The ultimate legacy of the Golden Age pirates is mixed. They disrupted legitimate commerce and terrorized innocent people. They tortured and murdered victims. They lived as criminals and died as criminals. Yet they also demonstrated that ordinary men could govern themselves democratically. They showed that hierarchical authority wasn't inevitable or necessary. They created multicultural communities that transcended the prejudices of their era. They lived with an intensity and purpose that many people in conventional society lacked. The balance sheet of their historical impact includes both profound negatives and surprising positives. What was it really like to be a pirate during the Golden Age? It was a life stripped to essentials: survival, wealth, freedom, companionship, and the constant proximity of death. It was existing without the comforts and structures of civilization, facing directly the fundamental challenges of human existence. It was hard in ways that would break most modern people within days or weeks. It was violent, filthy, painful, and short. It was also occasionally glorious, intensely meaningful, and absolutely free in ways that legitimate life could never match. It was a life that represented a kind of bargain, trading comfort, safety, and longevity for intensity, autonomy, and the chance at wealth. For some men, in some times, and the pirates themselves are long dead, their ships rotted away, their plunder spent or lost. But the questions they embodied remain relevant. How do we balance freedom and security? How do we distribute resources fairly? How do we govern ourselves when external authority is weak or absent? How do we create community among diverse people? How do we face death with courage? These aren't just historical questions, they're fundamental human challenges that every generation must answer. The pirates of the Golden Age provided one set of answers, imperfect and incomplete, but historically significant. Their lives, brutal and short as they were, illuminate something important about human nature and human possibility. That's why we remember them, why we tell their stories, why we remain fascinated by what it was really like to be a pirate.